Uruguay will melt down a Bronze Eagle found on a sunken World War II-era German destroyer off its coast 13 years ago, and recast it as a dove of peace, the South American country's president said. The 350-kilogram symbol of violence and war will be turned into a symbol of peace and union, President Luis Lacalle Pou told journalists in the capital Montevideo.
Beneath the crushing weight of the Atlantic, an untouched Nazi warship has been silently hiding a secret until now. When salvage divers finally reached its decaying hull, what they discovered wasn't rusted steel or forgotten cannons. It was something far more disturbing, a discovery so unexpected, so chilling that it sent ripples through entire governments. But now, the truth is leaking to the surface, and it changes everything we thought we knew. When most people think about World War II, they picture tanks rolling across Europe, or fighter planes dueling in the skies. But far out on the open sea, a far more shadowy and dangerous kind of war was unfolding. At the center of it all was Nazi Germany's navy, a force built to break the rules, bend international treaties, and quietly choke the Allies from below the waves. To really understand this strange and dramatic story, we first need to dive into the world it came from. The Nazi warship. The German Navy's actions in World War II represent one of the most aggressive naval strategies in modern history. Officially, they called it the Kriegsmarine. On paper, they were supposed to follow strict rules from the Treaty of Versailles, which limited how big and powerful their ships could be. But Hitler's team had other plans. Instead of playing by the rules, they bent them in ways that were both bold and risky. One of the best examples of this was the Admiral Graf Spee. She was known as a pocket battleship, a clever design meant to slide under the treaty's 10,000-ton weight limit. Fast for her size, she could hit speeds close to 28 knots. This made her a serious threat to enemy cruisers, while still being able to outrun many opponents if things got too heated. Now, I'm sure you might be wondering why the ship is being referred to as she. Well, that's not a slip. In naval tradition, ships have long been referred to as female. Some say it's because sailors depended on their ships like they would a mother to protect them. Others believe it's tied to old languages, where the word for ship was a feminine noun. Either way, even today, many still stick to the tradition. Then there were the heavyweights like Bismarck and Tirpitz. They weren't hiding anything. Each of these giants weighed in at over 40,000 tons and carried 8 massive 15-inch guns. They were wrapped in layers of thick armor, making them floating fortresses. Their job was to dominate the seas and scare the life out of the Allied navies. And for a while, they did exactly that. But their size was also a weakness. With the rise of radar, better reconnaissance planes, and tighter Allied coordination, these big ships became easier to track and target from the sky. They made a big splash, but in the end, their size worked against them. Now, while the big surface ships made headlines, Germany's real secret weapon operated below the surface. That's where the U-boats came in. These submarines were the sharks of the Atlantic, hunting both military and civilian ships. In the early stages of the war, smaller models like the Type 2 handled coastal patrols, but it was the Type 7 that really became the workhorse of the fleet. More than 700 of them were built before the war was over. They weren't the fastest or the flashiest, but they got the job done. With torpedoes, deck guns, and the ability to slip under the waves almost unnoticed, they caused massive headaches for the Allies. The mastermind behind the U-boat campaign was Admiral Karl Dönitz. He came up with the infamous Wolf Pack strategy, where groups of U-boats would stalk Allied convoys and attack them together, mostly at night. These coordinated strikes were brutal. Combined with the fact that they used encrypted Enigma codes to communicate, the U-boats managed to sink millions of tons of Allied shipping by 1942. For a while, Britain's supply lines were hanging by a thread. But the tide eventually turned. Once the Allies cracked the Enigma codes, and paired that with better radar, long-range patrol planes, and improved convoy tactics, the U-boats started taking heavy losses. May 1943, often called Black May, marked the beginning of the end for Germany's submarine dominance. U-boat sinkings skyrocketed, while Allied shipping losses plummeted, even though Germany tried to introduce new tech like the snorkel and the advanced Type 21 electro boot. Later on, it was too little, too late. Ultimately, Nazi Germany's naval power was a mix of massive surface ships that grabbed attention and stealthy submarines that quietly threatened Allied supply lines. The big battleships looked impressive, but it was the hidden war beneath the ocean's surface that came closest to tipping the balance. Eventually, though, the Allies adapted, and the German fleet couldn't keep up with the shifting tide of technology and tactics. Now, to really understand why what the salvage divers found was so shocking, we have to start with the ship itself and the intriguing story of how it ended up on the ocean floor in the first place. The ghost ship of WW2. The moment this warship went under, it didn't disappear. It became a ghost, one that's been floating in the back of naval history for decades. We're talking about the Admiral Graf Spee, one of Nazi Germany's so-called pocket battleships, launched in 1934. She wasn't huge compared to full-sized battleships, but she packed enough firepower to cause serious trouble. Fast, heavily armed, and built for long-range missions, her job was to hunt Allied merchant ships across the South Atlantic. In late 1939, she got a little too much attention. On December 13, 1939, 3 British cruisers tracked her down near the River Plate, using a plume of smoke that came from the ship. Outnumbered and running low on ammunition, her captain, Hans Langsdorff, steered her into the neutral port of Montevideo, Uruguay. The ship was damaged, and the crew hoped for time to repair and regroup. But international pressure started building fast. The British used diplomatic channels to make sure Uruguay wouldn't allow her to stay long. After a tense few days, Captain Hans Langsdorff found himself standing at a painful crossroads. He had done everything in his power to protect his crew, getting them off the ship safely and arranging for them to reach Argentina. But as the smoke cleared, the weight of losing his ship settled heavy on his shoulders. At that point, he really had 2 choices. One was to try and escape across the river to Buenos Aires. But out there, waiting beyond the horizon, the British had created the illusion that even more warships were gathering to trap him. Whether it was real or psychological warfare, Langsdorff wasn't willing to risk his men's lives in a breakout that could turn into a slaughter. The other option was to destroy the Graf Spee himself, making sure it couldn't be captured and used against Germany. He chose to sink her. The decision saved his crew, but it tore him up inside. On December 17, 1939, under the fading evening light, the Admiral Graf Spee was moved a few miles off the coast. The crew set explosives throughout the ship. When they detonated, the explosions tore through the hull, setting fires that quickly consumed what was left. The mighty warship finally sank into the shallow waters of the River Plate, about 11 meters deep. Her deck crumpled, her stern broke open, and her towering mast settled into the muddy bottom. With the ship gone and his sailors safe, Langsdorff felt there was nothing left for him to do. In his mind, a captain's fate was permanently tied to his ships. He wrote to his family and superiors saying, "I reached the grave decision to scuttle the Graf Spee to prevent her falling into the hands of the enemy. With the ammunition remaining, any attempt to break out to open water was bound to fail. Therefore, I decided to bear the consequences. A captain cannot separate his own fate from that of his ship. I can do no more for my ship's company. I am fully content to pay with my life for any possible discredit on the honor of the flag." And in his final words, he explained that only through his own death could he preserve the honor of the German flag. In the early morning hours of December 20th, 1939, inside a simple hotel room in Buenos Aires, Langsdorff made his final move. He laid out the ship's battle ensign beneath him, pulled out his service revolver, and his story came to a sorrowful conclusion. It wasn't about drama or spectacle. In his eyes, he was following his ship to the end. The shallow depth made it impossible for the world to forget about her. Parts of the ship could still be seen poking above the waterline for years. It wasn't some distant, unreachable wreck sitting miles below the ocean's surface. This one was sitting right off the coast of a busy capital city. Cargo ships had to carefully navigate around her. Harbor authorities worried about potential hazards, and historians, they saw a floating time capsule. The remains of the ship still held radar equipment, rangefinders, and an insignia that hadn't yet seen the light of day. But here's where the story takes a very strange turn. Only months after the Graf Spee sank, in 1940, a Montevideo-based engineering firm suddenly acquired the salvage rights for £14,000. That might sound straightforward, but it wasn't. British intelligence knew what was really happening. This so-called local firm was actually a cover operation set up by British intelligence working for the Admiralty. The British were very interested in what was sitting inside that wreck, and they didn't want anyone else getting to it first. But then, why did they care so much about it? You see, Graf Spee wasn't valuable to them because of its weapons or steel. What caught their attention was a new radar rangefinder the ship carried, something cutting edge for the time. The British wanted to study the technology to improve their own radar systems, so they quietly arranged for scientists to examine the wreck undercover, making sure no one suspected their real mission. Some of what they learned may have even helped shape future advancements in Allied radar technology. Decades later, the wreck still wasn't finished telling its story. So why does this wreck still draw so much attention after all these years? Because it's not just a sunken ship. It's a collection of hidden stories. There's the naval battle that led to its scuttling, the captain who chose to destroy his own vessel to avoid capture, the secret British intelligence operation working quietly behind the scenes, and a wreck that sat for decades, creating both logistical headaches and historical fascination. Once you understand what made the Admiral Graf Spee so important, it becomes clear why people risked so much to reach the wreck, and why its secrets still capture imaginations to this day. You'd think the story was over once the ship sank and the captain was gone, right? Not even close. What sat beneath those murky waters still had plenty left to reveal. Decades of silence and suspicion. For years, the Admiral Graf Spee sat quietly beneath the surface of the river plate, its rusting bones slowly fading into legend. Locals in Montevideo knew the spot well. On some days, when the tide pulled back, you could still spot parts of the steel hull poking out, like a ghost reaching up from the water. Fishermen would point at it, telling stories to wide-eyed kids. Tourists, too, would hire small boats and circle around what was left of the once deadly Nazi warship. But no one really knew what was still buried down there. At first, most people figured it was nothing more than a sunken wreck. The war was long over. The ship had been destroyed, and whatever secrets it held had probably gone down with it. But whispers started to spread. Some said that when the crew scuttled the ship back in 1939, they might have left something important behind. Maybe gold, maybe classified documents, or even experimental weapons. Theories fed the mystery, and over time, the Graf Spee stopped being just a wreck. It became a story, a question mark sitting at the bottom of the river. In the early 2000s, curiosity finally turned into action. A group of private investors from Europe and the United States got permission from Uruguay to salvage parts of the ship. But pulling a massive warship out of the mud wasn't going to be easy. The water currents were unpredictable, the riverbed was unstable, and unexploded ammunition made things dangerous. Their first big attempt didn't go well. While trying to lift the ship's rangefinder, one of the thick steel cables snapped, dropping the 27-ton piece back into the mud like a stone. It could have ended right there. But the team kept at it. In 2004, after a lot of trial and error, they finally brought up the telemeter, the device that once helped aim the ship's massive guns. It was one of the first real successes in recovering anything significant from the wreck. Then came the discovery that really caught the world's attention. In 2006, the divers managed to recover a massive bronze eagle, nearly 7 feet wide, with a Nazi swastika clutched in its talons. The 360-kilogram sculpture had once stood proudly on the Graf Spee's stern. Bringing it to the surface was like pulling a piece of World War II straight out of the mud. News of the recovery spread fast, not just in Uruguay but across the globe. Museums and private collectors were quick to show interest. Even the German government kept a close eye on the situation. But, as you might expect, the appearance of such a symbol brought controversy with it. Some feared neo-Nazi groups would try to get their hands on the eagle. Others worried it could disappear into private collections, hidden from the public eye. The simple act of pulling the eagle from the river had opened a complicated debate. Uruguay found itself in the middle of it all. What should they do with such a loaded piece of history? Some argued that it belonged in a museum where it could serve as a reminder of the past. Others believed displaying it risked giving oxygen to extremist groups. As all this played out, people started asking a bigger question. Why had the rest of the Graf Spee never been fully explored? Some said the ship might still be an unofficial war grave. Others suspected there were sealed compartments on board, hiding valuable or sensitive materials. Some speculated that authorities were cautious with the salvage process to maintain control over sensitive finds. This is where the rumors and speculations began to swirl. Some claimed the German government had quietly pressured Uruguay not to dig too deep, worried about what might come to light. Others insisted that earlier dives had found sealed rooms, but were ordered not to open them. When the eagle was finally recovered, it felt to many like proof that more secrets were still trapped inside the wreck. Meanwhile, historians, treasure hunters, and governments continued circling the site, each with their own motives. Scholars pushed for careful study and preservation, while private companies saw dollar signs. Uruguay tried to balance international diplomacy with protecting its own interests. Even German officials weighed in, calling for respectful handling of the site. The whole situation turned into a complex tug-of-war. By 2006, the Graf Spee had stopped being just a sunken battleship. It had become a symbol of unresolved history, tangled in legal fights, political debates, and ethical questions. The Bronze Eagle was no longer just a piece of metal. It was a key that had unlocked a larger mystery. And the biggest question of all remained unanswered. What else was still sitting down there, sealed away beneath years of mud and silence? But while the Graf Spee's wreck sat quietly beneath the waves, one artifact pulled from its ruins sparked a firestorm on land. What started as a routine salvage turned into a national controversy, raising tough questions about history, hatred, and how far a country should go to confront its darkest relics. The Eagle controversy erupts. When salvage crews pulled that 360-kilogram Bronze Eagle out of the sea back in 2006, they didn't realize they were also pulling Uruguay into one of the most heated debates in its modern history. It wasn't only a relic from a sunken Nazi battleship, it was a heavy physical reminder of one of the darkest periods in human history. And now, Uruguay had to figure out what to do with it. At first, the plan was simple. The Eagle was displayed briefly as a historical artifact. People could come and see it, learn about the Graf Spee, and reflect on history. But it didn't take long for concerns to surface. Many feared that even displaying a Nazi symbol risked attracting extremist attention, or worse, unintentionally honoring what it represented. In response, the government quickly pulled it from public view and stored it away inside a naval warehouse. For years, that's where it stayed. But in 2019, the situation got a lot more complicated. A Uruguayan court ordered that the Eagle be auctioned, with profits to be shared between the government and the salvage company that had recovered it. That decision triggered a global outcry. Jewish organizations, historians, and even the German government raised concerns. What if white supremacists or collectors with darker motives tried to buy it? What message would that send? Because of the intense backlash, the sale was eventually canceled. Then in 2021, Uruguay's Supreme Court ruled that the Eagle was officially government property. But that didn't end the debate. In 2023, President Luis Lacalle Pou tried to solve the problem with a bold and unexpected proposal. Instead of keeping the Eagle as it was, or selling it, he suggested melting it down and turning it into a dove of peace. The idea was symbolic. transforming a symbol of hatred into one of unity and hope. Acclaimed Uruguayan artist Pablo Achugari was even asked to handle the transformation. At first, some people, including certain Jewish leaders, supported the plan, but the support didn't last long. As the idea gained international attention, critics spoke out strongly. Historian Diego del Grossi compared it to turning Auschwitz into a nude camp, saying that trying to erase painful history like this was deeply offensive. Former lawmaker Anibal Gludowski echoed that same comparison. Writer Mercedes Vigil argued that erasing artifacts like the eagle would be like wiping out shared history altogether. She warned that if the world followed that logic, there would be very little history left to learn from. The president quickly realized how divided the reaction had become. In a press conference, he admitted, "If one wants to generate peace, the first thing one has to do is to generate unity." And clearly, this has not been done. Within days, he officially withdrew the plan. The controversy didn't stay confined to Uruguay. Across the region, including neighboring Argentina, the debate sparked even more reflection. Jonathan Karzenbaum, from the Buenos Aires Holocaust Museum, questioned whether transforming such a unique object was even necessary. He pointed out that while art has the power to send messages, certain artifacts need to remain as they are to remind future generations of the past. Argentine lawyer Carlos Mazlaton suggested a completely different approach, relocating the eagle to Jerusalem and placing it under a bold inscription condemning Nazism and honoring Zionism. His idea was to confront history directly, rather than reshape it. International organizations also weighed in. The Simon Wiesenthal Center urged Uruguay to preserve the eagle in a museum, warning against any private sale that might turn it into a trophy for extremists. Germany, which had originally opposed displaying Nazi artifacts, softened its stance. Officials suggested that as long as the eagle was presented in a careful and educational context, it could serve as a tool to teach future generations about the dangers of hate and fascism. Through all of this, Uruguay's Supreme Court stood firm. The eagle would remain government property, locked away in that same naval warehouse, sealed off from public view. It's still there today, out of sight, but not out of mind. The bronze eagle became much more than a sunken artifact. It turned into a symbol of how complex and uncomfortable dealing with history can be. Do you hide painful symbols so they're never seen again? Or do you confront them, study them, and use them to educate people about the mistakes of the past? That's the dilemma Uruguay continues to wrestle with. For now, the eagle sits quietly in storage, but every so often, the debate reignites, reminding everyone that even long-buried pieces of history have a way of resurfacing when the world isn't quite finished dealing with them. Now, while the eagle and the telemeter stole most of the headlines, they weren't the only pieces pulled from the wreck. In fact, some of what was quietly recovered adds even more layers to the Graf Spee's strange afterlife. Other salvaged artifacts. You might think the Graf Spee's story wraps up with the eagle and that giant rangefinder, but there's a lot more to this ship's underwater legacy. Over the years, teams of divers, historians, and curious explorers have pulled up all kinds of relics from the muddy floor of the River Plate. Each one adds a small but important piece to the puzzle of what life was like aboard the pocket battleship before it was scuttled. One of the most eye-catching finds came in 1997, long before the world turned its attention to the famous Nazi eagle. Salvage crews managed to bring up one of the ship's secondary gun barrels, a 15-centimeter monster that once fired in battle. You can still see it today, standing outside the Naval Museum in Montevideo. It's weathered by time and rust, but there's something almost majestic about how it stretches toward the sky. Tourists often stop to take pictures, while locals pass by it like an old neighbor who's been standing there forever. That wasn't the only big item to make it out of the water. In the years after the gun barrel came up, Recovery teams also managed to retrieve some of the ship's smaller deck guns along with pieces of its telegraph system. These might not sound as exciting, but for anyone who understands naval warfare, these were the heart of daily operations. Without the telegraphs, orders couldn't travel from the bridge to the engine room or to the gunners. Some of these items made their way into regional museums, where curious visitors can study them up close. Others ended up in private collections, quietly passed from hand to hand. They may not make headlines, but they're silent witnesses to the ship's everyday rhythm back in the late 1930s. And then there's the anchor. One of Graf Spee's giant anchors was also recovered and now sits along Montevideo's waterfront. You really can't miss it. This massive chunk of metal, sitting on a solid base with plaques telling its story, has turned into a kind of landmark. It's a fitting symbol when you think about it. An object once meant to hold a warship in place now stands as a prompt, anchoring the ship's memory right where she met her end. But not every artifact is as grand or heavy as a gun barrel or an anchor. Over time, many smaller pieces have surfaced too. We're talking about hundreds of small relics, metal fittings, naval plates, sections of ventilation grates, and random hardware that once held the ship together. Many of these have quietly found homes in private collections or museums scattered throughout Latin America. At first glance, a bent piece of metal or a faded plate might not seem like much, but when you start putting them all together, they tell a story of how this great warship was built, operated, and ultimately lost. One area that especially fascinated historians and engineers was the ship's optical equipment. These were the systems that helped the Graf Spee aim her guns with deadly precision. During later recovery efforts, divers managed to pull up parts of the rangefinder gear and other optical components, including lenses, wiring, and even some old light bulbs. These pieces may be small, but they were critical in giving the ship an edge during battle. Thanks to careful restoration, some of this equipment is now displayed behind glass in Montevideo's museums, allowing visitors to get a close-up look at the kind of cutting-edge targeting tech that existed long before computers handled the job. All these artifacts, big and small, serve as more than museum pieces. Together, they rebuild the physical world of the Graf Spee. They help us imagine what it was like for the officers and crew who lived aboard her, fought with her, and ultimately abandoned her in those tense final hours. Every bolt, plate, and lens recovered from the wreck is another thread tying us back to a world now almost a century gone. And yet, even with all these pieces recovered, you still get the feeling that the ship hasn't given up all its secrets. Every artifact that comes up from the deep seems to spark one more question about what might still be waiting down there in the muddy waters of the River Plate. Now, what if 2025 finally brings the breakthrough everyone's been waiting for? While nothing has officially surfaced yet, there's plenty of buzz swirling around new expeditions planning to revisit the Graf Spee's resting place. With better tech than ever before, advanced sonar mapping, deep-water drones, and precision robotics, researchers believe there may still be sealed compartments left untouched since 1939. Some experts quietly wonder if personal effects, hidden storage rooms, or classified naval documents could be sitting undisturbed under layers of silt. And then there's always the speculation that keeps treasure hunters awake at night. The possibility of secret Nazi cargo, gold, sensitive communication equipment, lost blueprints. Even a few unexplored rumors suggest that experimental technology or encrypted materials were deliberately left behind when the crew scuttled the ship. Historians also hope to answer long-standing questions about the Graf Spee's final hours. Did Captain Langsdorff hide certain items before ordering the scuttling? Were last-minute orders from Berlin followed that still remain unknown? When historians mention orders from Berlin, they're really talking about secret commands coming straight from Hitler's inner circle, based in Germany's capital. It was Berlin that pulled the strings for the entire war machine. For now, it's all speculation. But as technology continues to peel back layers of mud and mystery, the wreck of the Graf Spee might still have a few secrets left to whisper to the world. With every artifact recovered, we get closer to understanding Nazi Germany's shadowy operations. But will the full truth of the Graf Spee ever surface, or stay buried forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. To enjoy more content like this, tap on the next video on your screen.